Open.
Outspoken.
It's ophthalmology off the grid.
An honest look at controversial topics in the field. I'm Blake Williamson.
I'm Gary Wörtz.
Welcome to another episode of Ophthalmology Off the Grid. In this episode, Drs. Blake Williamson and Gary Wörtz continue the theme of the 2023 season to focus on building a business and building a brand. Dr. James Loden joins to share insights into his career and his experience building his practice. Support for this podcast comes from Bryn Mawr Communications. BMC produces a number of informative podcast series spanning a variety of topics in ophthalmology. Discover a new show at itube.net/podcasts.
Welcome to another episode of Ophthalmology Off the Grid, the 2023 season. This is episode number 2, and I got Gary Wörtz, the man, the myth, with me. We're back at it, as you know from our first episode, and it's going to be a really fun season. And I love how we're kind of staying focused with the theme of building your business, building your brand, and kind of having everything revolve around that central idea. Guests will change, ideas will change, experiences will change. But Gary, I feel like we had to come up with or start with a bang rather with our first guest here, and I think we picked someone that's gonna people are gonna like.
Absolutely. I'm so excited to kick this season off with our friend, our mentor, our big brother in ophthalmology, Dr. Jim Loden. I think everyone knows Jim, but he is a fantastic cataract refractive surgeon in Nashville, Tennessee. We're talking about building your brand and building your business. And, I'm just going to ask you, Blake, when you think of Jim Loden, what do you think of? We're going to embarrass Jim here for a second. What do you think of when you think of Jim? And I'll tell you what I think.
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of go deep with it. Like I think that there's stuff that's given, like great surgeon. People know about his skills. People know about the practice he's built. People know about his family. People know about those things. But like things that you may not know that I recognize, there's really 2 things that I've picked up on, sort of learning from him and becoming a friend and mentee. And that is number one. There's no bullshit with Jim. Like if he hears something on the podium, like he will stand up at the mic and call out. And I feel like I'm not quite there yet. I don't have the gravitas. Maybe like in 10 years I can like get up there. But if someone's saying something, even if I don't agree with it, I'm kind of like, that dude or that gal's been practicing for 30 years. I'm gonna let it slide, But Jim will get up and say something, and I look up to that. And the second thing I think about is he's disciplined. And what I mean about that is like when I go sit down, I'll go sit down in a meeting. I try to always sit next to him if I can. And I'm in like swim trunks that are still wet from the pool at Caribbean Eye. And I'm in like flops, and he's there and he's got his notepad out and he's like making notes. He's actively making notes. And it makes me feel so bad about myself because I'm like, I'm just, 5, 6, 7 years in, whatever it is. And I'm just kind of like acting like I know everything, no big deal. Yet he's sitting there making notes. And I always have noticed that about him. He's disciplined in his learning.
Yeah, I will say this, and Jim, we'll get your thoughts on what has made you successful and how you can help people maybe emulate your success. But I think when I think of Jim, again, same thing, family man, loves his boys, loves hunting, loves ophthalmology, he's given back so much. But, probably one of the things I think of, and this may surprise some people, is I think of a self-made man, a guy who basically had to take on the entire world and has come out the other side better for it. And Jim, maybe we'll get into that. Maybe that's a good jumping off point. But, when I first met you, I just sort of knew your dad was an ophthalmologist, and I just kind of figured that you had kind of fallen into that practice and life had been grand. And, you sort of make assumptions about people. But, we've had some really deep and long conversations over many, many years. And so that part of your story, I'm not sure everybody knows, and you don't have to necessarily go deep into it, but why don't you tell us a little bit about just as we start here, what your philosophy was starting in residency about how you're going to basically try to take on the world. I mean, I think that share what you want, but you were in a tough spot and you were basically forced to take on the world. And that is not an easy thing for someone in your shoes. So that's maybe where we'll start.
Yeah, life changed for me in April of 1990. Blake's dad was friends with my dad. My dad was an eye surgeon in Nashville. And on the treadmill one night, he rolled over dead of a heart attack. And we really didn't have the practice set up with a lot of good management. And thankfully, this was prior to the major cuts on cataract surgery. We were able to sell the practice. I was in my second year of med school at the time. I had no idea how to manage a practice. My sister was a business finance person. She had no idea how to manage a practice. Mom didn't. So we were pretty much forced to sell the practice at that point. And then I kind of looked around for a few years. Do I want to do anesthesia? Do I want to do some other surgical subspecialty? And I came back to the realization that I'd always wanted since high school is I was going to be an ophthalmologist. So I became an ophthalmologist in spite of it all. But then I had to compete once I moved back to Nashville, as Gary and Blake know. My dad's old practice was my number one competitor, and they were big time competitors. They're still good competitors right now, still competing against them 25 years later, but like Gary said, we came out the other side and everything's been great and we've had a lot of fun doing it.
Yeah. Blake, isn't that crazy? I mean, think about that just for a second. That's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's completely unbelievable. And it's funny, I always love to hear my dad's story about Jim's dad, because they were tight. And your boys look just like him too. My dad always comments on that, but I don't know if I could have done it like you did, especially, you were so young, you were in med school. It's not like it was like your first or second year in practice and you can pull yourself up by the bootstraps, take on his volume and roll. You didn't even know what you didn't know back then. So the fact that you were able to persevere and have, the practice that everyone looks to as the platform practice in your area is amazing.
And Blake, you said something really important then. You don't know what you don't know, right? I remember coming out of fellowship, my cornea fellowship with Frank Price, and going to work for a PRG practice for a couple of years and then buying them out. I still, even 3 years in, had no clue how to manage a business or how to manage cost and productivity. Those were just enigmas that you just have to learn the terrible school of hard knocks, right? Unless you have a dad or a mentor or a great management team, there's going to be a little bit of pain you have to go through along the way. Yeah,
it's one of those things. You're a kid until you have kids, and you don't know how to run a business until you're forced to run a business. Luckily I have a CEO administrator who's my brother. And so it's great. But there's a lot of things that I don't know, and if something happened to him, God forbid, I'd have to learn that. So Gary, I thought in that vein, maybe we kind of start off with one of our main questions of the season that I think we're going to try to ask everybody starting off. And really, Jim, it's just, from a high level, what would you consider to be one of your biggest successes in business? What's a great decision you made or experienced? What's one of the best decisions you've made that's related to your business in ophthalmology?
Yeah, that question's a layup for me right there, Blake. In 2007, I had the opportunity, I was introduced to a practice I'd known through my dad and his friends years ago in the late 80s and early 90s. It had been bought up by PRG and they'd kind of run it into the ground by the mid 90s and wasn't doing as well. And then by 2007, the business was totally underwater. They were going to close the doors. This was a practice over in West Tennessee, about 2 hours west of Nashville in a little town called Paris, Tennessee. And I bought the real estate, the surgery center, and the practice. And nowadays I have right at 100% ROI on that investment. So I'm just like, man, how could I find 4, 5, 6 more of these, right? Where you take a practice that was doing 250 cataracts a year and you turn it into a practice that does about 1950 a year in a small two-room ASC. You can churn, burn, and do it really efficiently in that scenario in a rural area. And that's been a great investment for me. I wish I could make more, find better investments like that.
Yeah, don't you think that's sort of what private equity is licking their chops on? You know, they see deals like this and they think, okay, we can sort of, you know, find margin there. But I think the question is like, those are hard to find. You know, I'm not sure if that fell into your lap, but you know, again, that was a big decision, I'm sure. Even though it's, you know, on the back end, you've had a great return on investment. You know, it takes a little while to figure out how to even vet a good deal. So as we're talking about, you know, building your business, can you walk us through when you're, you know, you've said things to me in passing like, Gary, you just got to get a Walgreens on a corner and do a triple net lease and Buddha bada bing, Bob's your uncle, and you make a lot of money on that. And I have no idea what any of that means, right? So like, Jim, when you're vetting a deal, okay, for the younger ones who are, you know, trying to figure out their head from a hole in the ground and how to, you know, not just do a capsulotomy, but how to get paid for it. How did you vet that deal? And as you're building your business, how do you try to figure out, like, does this align with my goals? Am I going to, you know, what is your process? 'Cause to me, this is a personal question. I'm very curious, how do you go about that?
Yeah. So one of the things I've learned is every time I step out of my real skill set, I get burned, right? I endure a lot of pain. I opened an optical business about 7 years ago, and we're just now getting rid of the pain right now, right? It was a lot of cash flow loss getting it up and going. We had the wrong management team in. So I stepped out of my real box of cataract refractive right there, and it's all going to work out great, right? I've overbuilt buildings that have taken years to get leased where I'm having to fund them. But yet now 7 years later, I just got my appraisal back on the building because we're using the building for collateral for a new ASC loan, and I'm up multiple seven figures, right? So you sit there and say, boy, the appreciating value of picking a good spot in a good progressive city like Nashville is a great thing, right? So if you're going into, I think a lot of opportunities are lost sometimes because people are so static in their thought process that I have to live here or I have to live there, right? And I want to be 15 minutes from work. Well, next week, I'm going to drive 2 hours to Paris, Tennessee, spend the night, but I'm going to do 80 cataracts and probably 30 yags in 2 days, right? Well, there's not a lot of people that get to do 80 cataracts in 2 days, right? Now, it's a little uncomfortable. You're getting out of your comfort zone. You're having to drive 2 hours to do it, right? You have to be willing to make some sacrifices on these deals. If you're just looking at the deal, you have to build in, and one of my big tips is you have to build in enough cash flow on your initial loan that you can operate however many months you think it's going to take to hit profitability, right? It may take a year, it may take 2 years, right? When you're buying something that's totally cash flow negative, only doing 250 cataracts a year, you know you're going to have to hit 800 really to be any chance of profitability. Maybe 700 you could break even, but you really need to hit that 800. You've got to figure out how long is it going to take me to hit 800, right? How many employees am I going to have? What are my salaries? What's my run rate for this year going to be? What's my rent going to be this year? And you build that into your loans so that you have enough time and you don't end up just burning out. You see this in the restaurant business quite often, right? They just don't have enough capital on hand to get their brand built in time, and they're closing their doors. So that's one of my big tips is always go borrow a little bit more money than you need to on the front end so that you're not scrambling for cash on the back end. The other thing you have to do is just really be willing to sacrifice. When I first started my practice, I took no salary for 6 months. I took 30,000 the next 6 months, and I took 60,000 entirety of the second year I was in practice, right? I pumped all the other cash flow into marketing, branding, and building the practice, right? It's a lot of people that simply don't want to go and say, I'm going to live on $30,000 like I did as a resident when you're out in private practice, right? And put that money back into the company. You have to be willing to suffer a little pain and put that money back into the company to make money on the big time scale.
Yeah, I think that one of the big things there, one of the big tips is that the business is a living, breathing organism, and you have to feed the business. So, the way we do our for our partners, we get our dividends quarterly, and there's a large chunk of it that we leave in the bank account, in the operating account. And we look at that, and it's a big number. And I think to myself, man, I own a big percentage of that. I'd like for that to be in my bank account. But that's the wrong way to look at it, because, COVID could happen, boom, and you need that cash flow. And, my brother always talks about how, he's had to have a cash call from the partners before. And it's easy to say, well, the partners will each have a line of credit at the bank. But if you go to that partner, you say, hey, you know what, I need $60,000 on Tuesday. That's rough, And so by keeping cash in the business, I think that's a huge tip. And the other thing that you pointed out that I like is that talk about buying another smaller practice instead of just hanging a shingle and just trying to create something out of nothing. For those listeners who are thinking about starting their own practice, I get asked all the time, like, what about just, hanging a shingle and just creating something out of thin air? I said, man, that is tough to do. What I would do is go buy an existing practice, specifically an OD's practice, a medical minded OD that's quite busy, and they might refer 150 cataracts a year to their ophthalmologist, but I bet you there's 1,000 in there, and there's diabetics in there, and there's glaucoma patients in there, and there's everything else that you'd mind as an aggressive surgeon who's wanting to take care of these people the right way, surgically minded physician, and you could pick up an OD practice for not a huge multiple and really turn that into something big,
That's a really valid statement, Blake. One of the hardest things to do is a de novo opening. I've done that one time, and it was a 5 to 6 year process to get cash flow positive. We were having to pump money into it for the first 5 years. It was painful. I learned a tough lesson on that. So I totally agree with you. Go out, buy a lower volume MD or a high volume OD practice. And each of these, I bought 3 MD practices in the last 25 years, and all of them were low volume, and we turned them into high volume, right? But you had to have that footprint to work with initially to start out. You had to have some base of patients to start with.
Yeah, it's kind of like Peter Thiel has a book called 0 to 1. And it's saying, it's much harder to create something that doesn't exist than it is to scale something that does exist. So for folks who are, looking for a good book about innovating or starting something up, 0 to 1 is a great book. While we got you on here, we want to go through a couple more questions, if that's okay. One thing I'd like to know is, how did you find your niche? You talked about like stepping outside of your niche and sort of cataract refractive. What drew you to cataract refractive? How did you know it was sort of where you wanted to go? And how did you sort of build your brand in Nashville, a very competitive city with a lot of world-class surgeons? How are you able to compete there and find your niche?
It's a little bit genetics, Gary. I'm a little bit like Blake, I'm second generation, and I had a dad with powerful personality as well, who is very business minded as well. I wish I'd had more time to get the download from him, as you and I have talked about before in other podcasts. I wish I'd had that knowledge. I feel like there's a whole lot of mistakes I wouldn't have had to learn the hard way. But just my dad and his mentors, getting to grow up around guys like Jim Gills and Ralph Berkeley, and just some of these big legends in ophthalmology that have been just great examples in my life. Seeing them, I was probably 20 years old when Dad sent me down to hang out with Gills for a few days. And man, I was exhausted. I was about to fall out after being with him for 3 days, getting up at 4:30 in the morning, getting home at 10 at night, and 50 surgeries and 50 pre-ops and 50 post-ops. And we then had to go ride bicycles home. It's like, man, this is intense. So I had a lot of people just setting a stage for me as this is what it looks like, right? From a really high view and high competitive environment. So I think that made it less intimidating going back into the Nashville market, right? And I was willing to make those sacrifices on the front end. I was willing to buy TV ads instead of cars and houses, right? That's a lot of it, is having that ability to say, I'm going to invest in the business and I'm not going to buy stuff, right? I'm going to put it into something that's going to build for a greater good.
I have this saying to my family, they're sick of me hearing it, but I say, listen, everything we buy is just future garbage, because I get sick of taking a load of stuff to Goodwill that has come in from Amazon last year. I'm like, let's build things that are going to actually appreciate. And so, yeah, we don't need more stuff.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Blake.
the only things worth buying are LASIK and childcare, the two most important things in the world.
Exactly.
You'll never say you're sorry for buying LASIK or childcare. Jim, you made a lot of great decisions, but I bet you made some bad ones. Tell me about like your worst decision. What was one of the worst business things that you had done that you wish you could take back?
Oh, the number one by far, no questions, is selling my first surgery center, part of it, to a surgery center management company. I won't use their name. I don't want to be liable for anything. But let me tell you what these companies do. They don't do anything. They are simply buying cash flow. It's all false, hollow promises. You end up having to manage the company. You end up having to pay for the marketing within your practice to grow their business, and they get 51%. You're doing all the work, and all they're doing is providing some cash. Well, let me tell you what, you're much better off going and getting a loan than giving up 51% of a company. That's just a terrible decision. I had terrible advisors. The money, when I was 40 years old, I'm 57 now. You get shown a multiple seven-figure number when you're 40 years old, and you're like, oh man, wow, sure, I'm there, right?
Right.
It was a horrid decision. It cost me multiple seven figures and being in that deal and getting out of that deal. So that was by far the most expensive disaster I've ever had.
Yeah, it's so hard. And I also, again, we bring in private equity, but that's something I sort of wonder about, if that's what our colleagues who have done private equity, and nothing against it. I mean, if it works for your practice, great. And I think in some ways they're staying in and really wanting to sort of grow organically and build for the future. So I don't know that's exactly like your deal, but it does seem like you're just sort of taking out a multiple, which is like a loan against your future earnings.
Correct. That's exactly what it is, right? And you calculate that up, right? At what point, how many years down the road is your break-even point? And do I think I would be doing as well or better than I am currently at this particular time in space, right? And there are multiples that do make it quite appealing, right? I mean, you just have to look at that and look at it from an actuarial standpoint. But for anybody who's younger, my advice is just have a lot of confidence and go in there. And if you have to have insight, are you really good at surgery? Are you good at patient care, right? Do your patients like you? Does your staff enjoy working for you? And do you really like getting out there and working the business? If you do, you're going to be quite successful, and you really don't need to partner up with other people on this, right? You need to just go out there and get a loan. But you do. One of the things I find so interesting is there's a lot of adversity to signing a personal guarantee. And to get to my level, you have to be willing to sign multiple seven-figure personal guarantees, right? A lot of people just aren't comfortable with that, right? Because if you fail, you're going to lose it all, right? It's going to go. They're going to take it from you. You sign the line, right?
Right.
But I'm not planning on that happening. So you have to have a comfort zone with some risk.
To that end, Blake, I'm sure you get calls like this, and I love being available for younger surgeons who feel comfortable enough to give me a call and say, hey, I'm going through this scenario, or I'm trying to buy in, or I'm trying to, get a deal going with so-and-so person. What would you advise me? And it always comes down to, what's fair? Like, the practice always wants the young doc to, put in their time and pay probably more than they want to pay. And the young doc is always sort of stuck in this, conundrum of, do I just sort of take it on the nose and go work for this person, maybe get a partnership deal down the road, or do I hang a shingle, or, and they sort of feel stuck. Jim, when you have these conversations with people, I mean, do you feel like the conversation has just changed where people expect to have, like a $300,000 job right out of residency, where they basically just show up and do work and just get paid, and, like not putting in a lot of that sweat equity like you did? I mean, what do you, if you had this conversation with a young doc who's maybe a couple years out of residency, they're maybe disenfranchised with their first practice and looking to either move or start their own practice, how do you counsel them about making that decision?
Well, first thing I think you said is the disenfranchised doctor, right? That's the easiest one to have a great conversation with. Someone straight out of school who doesn't know what they don't know is really difficult to have this conversation with. They do seem to feel entitled to, I want this big salary. And by the way, I want to be off at noon on Friday. And I don't really want to see LASIK post-ops on Saturday morning, right? Well, I'm turned 58 next month, and I'm still going to be seeing LASIK post-ops this Saturday morning, right? So I really think there's a little bit of an entitlement out there, and you just have to understand, what do you want, right? Do you want a no-risk job where you're going to have a good salary and a good lifestyle? Or do you want to take on risk and invest, and then maybe you get to fly to the ACOS meeting on your own plane instead of sit in line at the Southwest counter, right? It's all about what you want and what your long-term goals are, but you're never going to get big without risk. And that, I think that's the biggest thing people have to get comfortable with, is being willing to lay that big stack of cash down on the table and say, I'm willing to be all in, right?
And I think it depends on, again, like you said, who it is, who you are, and who you are. There's a lot of people listening to this podcast who say, sheesh, I really don't want to drive 2 hours and do 80 cataracts in 2 days.
That's it, right?
A lot of people who listen to this, a lot of them, they actually couldn't. And even if they could do it, they don't want to do that, right? And that's okay. Right. That's why there's people like them and people like us. And to us, we think, I mean, we have a lot in common, and so we gravitate towards that. But a lot of folks just aren't built that way, and that's okay. So I think the question changes depending on who you're talking to. So, Jim, maybe in these last couple of minutes here, I just wanted to ask you just a high-level question about success. How do you kind of define success now at 57, 58 years old, and has that changed from what you thought when you were 40? What does success mean to you now? How's it changed over time?
Yeah, I think getting married at 37 and kids at 40, and then finally growing up a little bit, changed my view of success, Blake. I think in the early days, it was, how fast can I build? How many cases can I do per hour? How much, gross revenue can I generate per unit of time? How big can I make my practice, right? That's now morphed into, all of that's fun, and it's a measuring stick of work for all of us A-type, super competitive people. But yet success now is Heather, my wife, my two boys, James and Reed, and my faith, right? And we just enjoy our time together. The work is a way for us to have an income stream that we can enjoy our time together. I try not to let work dominate our lives. I try not to be a workaholic, even though I am. I try to make sure I factor in time for my wife and my children and my church time. But that's the real way that life has changed at 57, almost 58 now. That my dad died at 59. I'm acutely aware of my age right now, that life is temporal. We're all going to leave. We're not getting out of here alive. So enjoy that time and don't become just totally obsessed with your work and worrying. And that's my summary of where success is in my life now.
Yeah, that is awesome. I don't know that you could have much better definition. I know we all sort of have, different ways we sort of measure success, but I love that. I will say, I'm proud to know you. I'm proud to know you as a mentor, surgically and business, but also as a mentor, just as like a husband and as a father, and someone that I get a chance to bounce ideas off of, not just ophthalmology. So, Blake, any parting words before we wrap this up?
Man, I just appreciate your time, and looking forward to watch how Tennessee does coming down the stretch this season in basketball, shooting some good hoops right now.
I'm not sure it's going to be as good as our football season Blake.
Thank you so much, Jim. We'll see you next time.
All right, guys. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Ophthalmology Off the Grid. And thank you to our co-hosts, Drs. Blake Williamson and Gary Wörtz, and our guest, Dr. James Loden. Tune in next time for a further discussion of the business of ophthalmology.